All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Margot Conahan, ACRL's Manager of Professional Development. Thanks for joining us for today's ACRL Presents webinar. Our goal for these webinars is to bring our colleagues together to discuss issues of broad interest and importance to the academic and research library community. We really appreciate you being here with us today. As you just heard, today's session is being recorded, and we will email out the link to the recording shortly after the webinar. It'll also be available online on the ACRL website. Today's webinar is Cultural Proficiencies for Racial Equity, a Framework. Members of the CPRE Framework Task Force will provide an introduction to an overview of the framework, which was approved in summer 2022 by the boards of the 4 partner associations, which were the American Library Association, ACRL, the Association of Research Libraries, and the Public Library Association. I'd like to thank our presenters for being here with us today. Our presenters today are Christina Fuller-Gregory, Assistant Director of Library Services at the South Carolina Governor's School for the Arts and Humanities, and Mark A. Puente, Associate Dean for Organizational Development at Purdue University. Christina and Mark, please take it away whenever you're ready.
All right, now I'm able to unmute. Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be here with you today, along with my colleague, Mark, to talk with you about the Cultural Proficiencies for Racial Equity Framework. So what is going to happen today? During this session, we're going to share with you a brief background on the CPRE project. We're going to introduce to you the 4 frames, provide some actionable steps for engaging the framework, because we know that you want to talk about what's next as it relates to that, to utilizing the framework. And then we're going to end with Q&A in case you have some pressing questions that you want to ask Mark or myself. So to repeat, we're your presenters, but we don't need to belabor the point. I'm Christina Fuller-Gregory, and
hello, everyone. Mark Puente.
All right. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mark to start us off.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, Christina. Good to see many familiar names in the chat. Can't see your faces, but hopefully you can see mine. So I'll just start with providing just a little bit of background about the development of the framework. And we have some of our collaborators in the development of the framework actually on the webinar today. So this project was initiated out of conversations that I had many years ago with then the director of ALA's Office of Diversity Outreach and Literacy Services, so ODLOS, who was Jody Gray. I was at the time the senior director of Diversity and Leadership Development Programs for the Association of Research Libraries, ACRL. So we approached the executive directors of all of the partner organizations, as Margot indicated, the Public Library Association, ACRL, and of course ALA and ARL, about the possibility of pursuing this project. The lead for ALA was transitioned to Kristen LaHerde, who led ODLOS after Gray's departure, I believe in 2019. And Kristen and I worked together to create a task force to help develop the project through an open call for participation across all of those library organizations. And, you know, we paid particularly attention when we developed the roster of those who were going to be contributing to the project to ensure that there was broad representation across all their library types, largely focused on public libraries and, of course, academic and research libraries. But we wanted to be certain that the task force represented people from different types of academic libraries, different types of public libraries, and that we had representation within the group across race and ethnicity, gender, of course, geography, and we certainly wanted to include, we're deliberate about wanting to include voices from Canadian institutions as well as LIS education. Of course, it probably goes without saying that this program was initiated in late 2019, that the timeline for the project, as well as our plans for how to conduct this work, was seriously disrupted by the global pandemic. So as again, Margot indicated that it wasn't until late summer of 2022 and following, by the way, I should say, a lengthy period of open comments, that all of the partner institutions completed processes whereby the leadership of the respective partner organizations, the boards basically of each of the organizations, approved and endorsed the framework. Next slide, if you please. So the framework is intended to be foundational in its nature, and I believe we articulate that in the document itself, right? That is to provide both the theoretical and the practical grounding whereby those employed in public and academic libraries can better understand the systemic nature of racism, as well as how systems, both historical and contemporary, result in differential outcomes for people from minoritized and racialized identities. And we use those terms, racialized and minoritized, deliberately. It is meant to be a starting point, really, for conversations about practical strategies, that is, concrete steps that individuals, organizations, and institutions can take to counter what we see as the deleterious effects of racism within our organizations, but also within our profession and in society at large. Moreover, the framework challenges us to think critically, and again, I'll use that term a lot, critically about the profession's approaches, historically speaking, to diversifying its workforce. That is, focusing on recruitment as really the sole strategy for many, many decades for bringing about more equitable representation, and the relative failure, I would say, at least in terms of racial and ethnic representation within the profession, of those strategies over time. We have the data to support this. So that's not to say that there hasn't been a great deal of benefit from recruitment programs. I don't mean to imply that, but certainly the fact that we've been able to do very little, make very little progress in terms of diversifying our workforce, I think says a lot about our whether there is need to maintain the status quo, in terms of our strategies for recruiting people and for making more inclusive organizations and institutions. So this was just an opportunity, particularly after and it happened in tandem with respect to the racial awakening that happened really worldwide, that caused us to really pause and think about whether these strategies are really being effective. Next slide, please, Christine. So at the same time that the framework recognizes the limitations of libraries, archives, and other cultural heritage and memory organizations to move systems with respect to racial equity, it really challenges us, I think, to think critically and honestly about the role that we've had in upholding and sustaining systems of disadvantage within our professional domain and outside of it. We hoped to provide, through this exercise, a foundation off of which individuals and organizations could build praxis, that is, both the theory and practice, that could help make libraries, archives, and other cultural heritage and memory institutions better places for minoritized people, both within the profession, those who are attracted to it, and of course, those whom we are serving through our professional practice. And next slide. I think Christine is trying to unmute. There you go.
Awesome. It worked. Okay, so thank you, Mark. And now we've kind of shared with you the history of the framework. So from this point, I want to talk to you a little bit about what those frames are. We both will be, and what we can do in terms of practice around the frameworks. So let's begin by reintroducing it to some and introducing it to those who have not yet heard about the 4 frames. Our 4 frames are addressing and interrogating how white supremacy, white privilege, and racism show up in libraries, accountability, assessment, and implementation, building cross-sector cultural proficiency, and anti-racist leadership. So within the scope of these 4 frames, there's a ton of content. There's so much to unpack and so much to action upon. And so what we're going to do here is kind of drill down on what it may look like, almost an imagining around what it could look like for you in your libraries to action upon the frame. So let's start with frame one. Frame one is addressing and interrogating how white supremacy, white privilege, and racism show up in our libraries. And so it cannot be done without, as Mark so eloquently said, understanding those historical inequities that just simply exist. So within the scope of this frame, we talk about many things. We talk about methodologies for self-assessment. We talk about libraries and racial equity. What does that practice look like? What does your internal practice around racial equity look like? Does it even exist? We talk about the language of racial equity and white supremacy, and we discuss something called the competency continuum. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. So all of these things are discussed in the framework in frame one. So as you're thinking about, oh, this is a lot of content, how do we really unpack this? And let's talk about how. So these are the 4 competencies: awareness of racial identity, manifestations of racism, analysis of racialized outcomes, and commitment to countering racism. So these 4 competencies are critical to really actioning upon frame one. And so when we're saying that, what exactly are we saying? So for instance, we're thinking about how and to what extent does the construct of race exist in our libraries? We're asking ourselves how it shows up in our behaviors and our actions, thinking about how comfortable or uncomfortable and acknowledging the outcomes of race. So things like that hiring piece, but of course we can't talk about hiring without talking about the retention. And those internal mechanisms that we have, those structures that are just naturally in place that prevent minoritized populations from excelling in libraries. And then finally, what will we commit to do in response to all of those aforementioned questions that I just mentioned? So this is really understanding those 4 competencies. And it is important to note that I think any of this work, it can't be done without asking ourselves those questions, a series of questions. And your questions may not be the ones that I just shared, but similar or close. And in those questions, we formulate the answers that lead to that substantive action or change. So approaches to utilizing the frame. So we want to talk with you about how you use a frame. And so we'll share that with you, but we'll also share with you some guiding questions that you may want to ask as you're utilizing these approaches. So the one approach is utilizing the 4 competency to develop a racial equity assessment for staff. We call those questions that you see in the font below our guiding questions. So when you're thinking about using the 4 competencies, thinking about what your internal structures are around race and equity and all of those things, how might we use what we learn to approach trust, to trust and mend, create trust building? That is really an important piece. If you're doing this, you're wanting it to be, as Mark always says, and I love that repairing of relationships. Building awareness of white supremacy work culture and how those tenets show up in your library. A guiding question that you may ask yourself is, where and how are white supremacy work culture behaviors demonstrated in our organization? And if they do exist, what must we do to confront them? And really not if they exist. And because they exist, what might we do to confront them, right? And then creating a safe space for open and authentic acknowledgement of past racial inequities in your organization with the goal of addressing and redressing. And the guiding question here is, are our acknowledgements of an issue or a concern accompanied by actions? So I think acknowledging it is one thing, right? But moving the step beyond to actioning. And this is what we're really here to talk about with you today, using the framework as that foundation for those actions. And now we want to engage you and find out what you're thinking. So we have a question and you're welcome to drop into the chat. We talked about those 4 competencies that we shared with you: awareness of racial identity, where you're kind of understanding to what extent the construct of race exists in your organization, those manifestations of racism, how is it showing up in your behaviors, the analysis of racialized outcomes, how comfortable or uncomfortable are you in acknowledging what is happening and doing something about it, and that commitment, what happens next. Where are you? And which of the 4 competencies are you most proficient? I'd love to know if you're drop in the chat. Where is your organization right now? And as you're responding and dropping in the chat, we have another question because we want to know. Where do you find opportunity for greater engagement? Where does that exist in your organization? So considering those 4 competencies that we just shared, where do you find opportunity for greater engagement? Where can you lean in more? Where can you do more work? We want to know. Please share it with everyone. We're seeing a lot of that commitment to countering racism coming through, lots of that D and A and D, awareness and commitment. Yes, I think for a lot of us, we are aware, but it's those next steps that are really difficult and to act upon. We really want to find those methods for doing that. And thank you all for responding, everyone who dropped into the chat. So frame 2 is accountability, assessment, and implementation. Within this frame, we're talking about anti-racist objectives and strategies that often talked about, hiring, retention, and advancement piece, strategic planning, policies and procedures. What are those looking like in your organization? The sharing the work of BIPOC communities and allies, because we know that we can do BIPOC communities, we could do so much, but with those allies, we could do so much more. Accountability in our racial equity work. We talked a little bit about that in the previous slide around the 4 competencies, and solidarity and librarianship, and then those power relationships in the field, because we know that even within the scope of libraries, power and privilege structures exist, right? So talking about them and thinking about them in our libraries within frame 2. So we want to come back again with those approaches to using the frame. When we're thinking about frame 2, and so much was in that, the hiring, retention, and advancement, and the power dynamics and analysis of that, strategic planning. One approach to using the frame and guiding your work is shifting strategic planning methodologies to center an equity-centered approach. So what am I talking about when I say equity-centered approach? So we all know what SMART goals are. They're specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound. But what we would love is to see you step beyond that and make them SMARTY. So specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound, inclusive, and equitable. So make those SMARTY goals. That is just an extra added component to thinking about your strategic planning and as your goal setting for the future of your libraries. Also, conducting a comprehensive policy review through a DEI lens. And when you're doing this, the guiding question for you is, what stories are your policies reflecting? Because believe it or not, each of our policies tell a story. They either tell a story that is inclusive and equitable and welcoming to all, or it may tell a story that may be different. So looking at those policies through that particular lens. And then finally, considering the measurable investments your organization has made to contribute to the success of BIPOC staff throughout their professional life cycle. So thinking about that hiring and retention and advancement, less the hiring, more the retention and advancement. What are you doing throughout the life cycle of a BIPOC staff member or colleague or someone that you hired? How are you ensuring that they are successful? And looking at that as a guiding question, what and how are we ensuring the success of BIPOC in our libraries? Just 3 approaches to this frame and 3 guiding questions for thinking about how you may center this work. And because we love to talk to you and not at you, here's another question. In what ways are your organization's goals of reducing barriers to opportunity and racial inequities reflected in resource allocations? So if you can think of something that you're doing that is unique to your organization that you'd love to share in our chat, please do. We want to have this conversation going on as we share with you more information about the frames. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mark for frame 3. And as we wait for Mark to unmute, as he's doing right now.
Okay, I think I'm up. Okay, so frame 3, building cross-sector cultural proficiency, influencing and affecting change in other professional and political spheres. This is really, I think, critical. So with frame 3, what we're really doing is embracing paradox in a way, which is a countercultural way of approaching an issue. But because while in a sense, libraries and archives, again, as I mentioned earlier, are not able necessarily to fix an intractable problem like racism, we can and should, as previously mentioned, own and our part in upholding and enacting equitable practices. And I mean, as a public good, we have the responsibility of ensuring that the narrative of how we got here is appropriately curated and contextualized so that we can position ourselves for action to counter the inequities that are deeply ingrained in our systems. This is, of course, core to organizational mission, for all of us in libraries, and it's reflected in all the things that we do, whether that's collections building or instruction or reference and information services provision, descriptive practices, data policies, and of course, again, our hiring, advancement, and retention policies. I mean, given the breadth of our stakeholders, it should be easy to see the implications for this work beyond our physical and virtual walls. Are there opportunities for us as professionals and individuals to engage these issues in civic platforms or to show our commitments through decisions that we make about where we live, about the restaurants and bookstores that we frequent, about the financial investments that we make, and the political candidates that we support? Next slide, Christine, please. So these, I won't spend a lot of time on the specific, there we go, strategies that we're proposing, but creating a list of organizations and individuals both within and outside of your sphere of influence, right? With that guiding questions, in what ways do we demonstrate an interest in turning outward and thinking beyond the library walls, right? Moving aside and moving up, how comfortable are we in ceding power, right? Providing agency outside of our organizations and developing community partnerships as an example to help guide initiatives through the lens of their lived experiences. And of course, identifying those ways that, in spite of our best of intentions, that are ways that we're still wanting to hold on to power. I think it's an important question. And how do we, where should I say, do we find alignment between the work that we've been told we cannot do, and we'll talk about this in greater depth a little bit, and the responsibilities that we really have to do. What does that look like for us? Next slide, please. Okay, and the fourth frame, again, is around anti-racist leadership, and that is speaking specifically to the roles that these meta-organizations, like the organizations of ALA that were involved in this project, but also the Association of Research Libraries, and what are the roles of individual members in terms of advancing our own strategic initiatives around this. This is very tricky, and it's a very difficult, I think, space right now, right? Just to reiterate what's already been said, this is by no means implies that we summarily dismiss every value and every procedure, right, that we do that is connected to Western culture and epistemologies. But anti-racist leadership does require that we think, again, critically about the degree to which holding on to these principles has done great damage, sometimes irreparable damage, to people from minoritized and racialized identities. The irony isn't lost, I think, on anyone that many, if not all, of the larger, better resourced, more prestigious institutions have benefited most from white supremacy practice and culture. So many of those same institutions, I think, can now stand as exemplars for how organizations can work to counter that legacy and the modern manifestations of inequity based on race. So this is increasingly difficult, obviously, as we all recognize, with the challenges happening today on federal and state levels to many of the interventions or to the programs that are focused on DEI, much less anti-racism, programs that are meant to quote unquote level the playing field, as we say. But again, the irony is that in as much as I think that many of these efforts are necessary and have been necessary, and the benefits of recruitment and leadership development programs, as an example, have been largely felt for individuals, organizations, and institutions, these are all band-aids, essentially, being applied to what amounts to severed limbs, if you'll pardon the uncomfortable imagery here. But anti-racist leadership requires that we focus on systems, that we are comfortable with discomfort. Next phrase, slide, if you will, Christine. And so again, here are the guiding questions, right? How are we keeping track of our efforts to build an anti-racist practice? I mean, can we do that? Did we do what we said we were going to do, what we're going to set out in that strategic plan to do? Did we succeed? Did we lose our way? Did it have a different impact than what we had anticipated? How do you prioritize your efforts, right? How do we continue to center an anti-race practice as interests and narratives in libraries shift? The language is going to shift. Our perspectives are going to shift. Scholarship is going to shift. So how can we position ourselves to be agile in really conducting and supporting this work? And then finally, again, asking uncomfortable questions. What can we do to demonstrate to these broader meta organizations, right? And telegraph to them a continued desire to learn more about this work, to do more to support this work, and to advocate for a holistic approach to doing this work. Next phrase. I keep saying phrase. Next slide. Okay. So again, this work is really important. It requires us to think again about this work as a journey and not necessarily as a destination. Unfortunately, I think we all feel that this work is going to continue beyond my lifetime, beyond this generation, perhaps for many, many generations. And how do we position ourselves to continue the work? How do we continue to support libraries in identifying those opportunities for using this framework, right, to inform, again, people, policy, procedure, so that it can have an effect on organizational culture, organizational climate, right? How do we introduce opportunities for taking a future thinking approach to racial equity work in terms of really imagining what a future could look like for us, not only as a profession, but also as society, and building those cross-sector alliances to engage in this work in a productive way together. And again, how do we continue to prioritize the work? I'd like to kind of end this portion with some reminders again that it's in spite of everything going on around us, that we can certainly recognize the backlash that is happening all around us, and we have to remain committed to this work. It's understandable that many more people, for many people, that this work has become next to impossible to do in our current environment. And as much as this is a setback for the profession, I feel, and for higher education and for society, I mean, what is happening right now is a case study in replicating white supremacy for organizations. For some, it might make most sense just to step back from the work until the climate changes a little bit. For others, you might have to be creative about what you call it, about what you label it. There are many who do this work who would bristle at that suggestion. I completely understand that. And who would assert that we have to be explicit and deliberate about what we call this work. I do not disagree with that, but I know we're all on a different journey, and many of us have families, to support, bills to pay. These are scary times for some. But for those of us with the privilege and with, the support to continue this work, we have to remain committed to it. And in some respects, it's more important that we continue this work than ever before. And the next slide. So, having heard about the four frames, again, we'd love to hear from you. Take a moment to think about it, and please respond in the chat for us. Which of the four frames really pulls you forward? Which motivates you to do this work for you personally and or for your organization? What are your thoughts about that? some good examples in the chat about some practical strategies. This is wonderful. Yeah.
And we encourage you to share with us, and or if you need to think a little bit more about the frames and your organizations and how they align, please do. Absolutely, I can go back to that slide.
And to go to
Someone
Juliana.
asked if I would
I'm
go
sorry,
back
go
to the
ahead.
slide with the frames. There we go.
There we go.
So we'd love to know which of the 4 frames is really resonating with you right now. There's so much content. There's so much to unpack and action upon. But we all know it starts somewhere. And where is that somewhere for you?
Yeah, in answer to Juliana's question, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, that with respect to are any of these more important than others, we really took a deliberate approach. It's you know, our mindset, our Western way of thinking about things is to take a very linear approach. We have to do one and accomplish one before we do number 2, before we do number 3. We do think that there is a foundation to this work, but I think it's almost like a pendulum, right? There are ways to engage at a certain moment in time that you'll have access to, that you'll be able to do. And so from that perspective, I don't think there is necessarily prioritization. In terms of, I will say, in terms of anti-racist leadership, I think it's quite common for strong leadership to come from individual contributors within our organization, and not necessarily people that have titular power or, you know, a lot of control over budgets and that sort of thing. So I think that's really important. But I also think that you have to have commitments from senior leadership within organizations in order to substantively and authentically affect change. So, but that's my thinking about it.
Great. Right. And so thank you for everyone for responding to that question. And as we're kind of getting back to where we were, we'd love to know how might the framework serve as a continued call to action for you. As Mark so eloquently said, they're so, we in libraries, it almost feels like we are always on to the new thing, right? So everyone is talking about AI, but how do we let everyone else know, everyone know that in libraries, our continued focus and attention to our practice of looking at equity and inclusion and diversity and all aspects is of relevance and importance. So how might the framework serve as a continued call to action for you? Right. Exactly. It is really a starting point. I love that you said that it allows you to jump off for discussions, like, right? It is a starting point for you in engaging those discussions, those conversations. We like to think it all starts with a conversation, right? It's a great place to start. If there are no formalized efforts in your organization and you may feel like you have a long way to go, those grassroots approaches, you know, around starting the conversation will be critically important.
And thanks to Olivia for acknowledging that having a formalized document to point to can make a compelling argument. You know, I think it's helpful, right, to have the endorsements, right, the approval of these 4 library organizations that collaborated on this. It's you know, but it's not a guarantee, right? It's not a guarantee that people are going to pay attention. And so you know, it's a tricky part of the work, and it's something that we really have to consider in terms of not only how we make organizational commitments to this, but how we engage individuals in doing this work. Because historically, I'm not saying that there hasn't been a trajectory, you know, a history of allies and champions, co-conspirators in this work who identify as white, but so often the weight of this work it falls upon the shoulders of minoritized, racialized individuals, right? And it makes it tough. It makes it tough to continue the work. So That's why I say, it's okay to step back every now and then if you
Right.
really have to, right? So anyway, I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that and reflect on that comment a little bit. Yeah, it's terribly messy work, and that is okay. Absolutely.
And so now we share with you about the frames. We want to know if you have any questions. So we wanted to create enough space so that we can answer any questions that you may have around the framework.
So I feel compelled to also comment on Jesse Scott's comment there about naming white supremacy is so powerful, but it can be so triggering, and absolutely 100%. So we were deliberate in this framework, I think, and in thinking about what white supremacy is, because people immediately go to extremism. They think about, people in white hoods and these sorts of things. And certainly it encompasses that as well. But what we're talking about when we name white supremacy is we're talking about valuing human beings based on racial identity, right? So that's what we're talking about. When we talk about white supremacy culture, we're talking about all of those things that Western ways of thinking and Western culture has brought to us in terms of how we get the work done day to day, how we value the things, how we come to value the things that we value, how we assess the things that we assess, all those things. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't mean that we summarily dismiss all of those things as bad or wrong, but at least let's look at these things with a critical eye and understand that not everybody prefers or thrives with that same value system, valuing the same way of getting that work done that we have all learned to kind of embrace and kind of live with, unfortunately, right? So, yeah.
I love it.
I see a question from Kelsey here in the chat. And I'm sorry, my cat just came in the room and is very meowy, so I hope you don't hear that. Asking what are the best tools for self-assessment on a smaller level? For example, Department of Library within Division of Learning Resources within college as a whole.
So, Christina, do you want to try that? I have a few suggestions, but okay. So there are a number out there. There were quite a few. As a matter of fact, ALA and the name is escaping me. I can't remember now what that framework for assessment around. It's broader. It's around diversity, equity, and inclusion. But there's certainly lots of implications there. But it's basically like an assessment tool, a scorecard that you go through, right? The ALA scorecard. Thank you, Jessica. There are some that are there are many assessments that are not necessarily free, but that's hello, capitalism. And again, I would look at, particularly from the University of Southern California, they have a center called the Race and Equity Center, and they have a number of, I think, really useful tools there. And if I'm not mistaken, they also have a racial equity scorecard that you can, and I'm not certain if it engages on both individual and organizational levels, but that's another tool. There's a website I'm sure everybody knows about this, but it's race equity tools. I'll find the link and put it into the chat. If somebody doesn't beat me to it, they have a number of resources that you can reference, and many of them are openly available.
Thank you. Another question that's come in is wondering if there's a companion bibliography or resource list that helps guide education on the framework.
If you have not, yes, there is a bibliography alongside the framework. So if you're ever looking at the document that is a framework, at the very end, you will see a companion document, a bibliography of sorts, that will provide greater context for what is discussed in the framework itself.
And just to add, there are so many good resources, LibGuides. There are just many wonderful resources out there. So yeah, it's really, there are too many. Too many. We couldn't possibly consume all of the good information that's out there. But yeah, I would do some searching across many institutions. Thank you, Jessica. That GARE toolkit is really helpful as well. Yep.
There is another question that has come through asking, how can individuals get their leadership to buy in into using the frames and doing the work?
Christina, go ahead.
So I think that's a great question. I think that a really great way to get your administration to buy into utilizing the framework is to find that area in which there's that shared interest, in which that interest of area of value, something that everybody as a collective is working on, that could be viewed through this lens of the framework. I think that's a great way. So maybe an approach to a policy, and then taking the time to view it through the lens of the framework. So some of the approaches that we share in the framework, taking that and then sharing that with them as a possible way to integrate the framework into some of the decision-making processes. So I think there's many applications for it, but I think I've found it best if you find that that area in which you're trying to make substantive change. I think in each of our libraries, no matter what you're doing, there is always an area in which you're trying to make substantive change and enact change, and then take the framework as an exemplar of a way to support that work. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, Christina, if I can just build on that, absolutely. I say pilot, experiment, iterate. Find a piece of the framework that applies to your particular practice, right? Engage some sort of process, whether it's an assessment process, developing, a policy around descriptive practices in archives or whatever. And also point to exemplars outside of your organization. That creates some peer pressure that speaks to leaders, in my opinion. Also, and speaking of peer pressure, we are engaged in this work at Purdue. I think at a substantive level through we have something, our Big Ten, which you normally think about football when you think about the Big Ten, but there's the Big Ten Academic Alliance Library Initiatives Program, and we are doing a lot of work in this space across many different functional sort of areas related to mission. And when the directors, these are large institutions, large, complex, bureaucratic institutions, but when the directors start articulating the value of engaging that framework in a way that makes sense and that resonates with their co-directors, cohorts, I mean, that speaks, I think, you can't articulate a better value proposition than that. So, now how do you make that work? Again, a lot of times that leadership comes from individual contributors. Do that work, articulate that value proposition, the benefit, how the organization and the institution is benefiting from that work, and make sure that you are in panel presentations and that you are publishing about that work and that you're blogging about that work and that, that other people are aware of the value of that work that you're bringing back to your organization and institution.
Thanks to you both. Another question. How would you respond to colleagues who may say that other isms and phobias aren't being addressed with this framework?
Yep, you can start. You want to start?
Okay. Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And this is what I would say. And these are not my words. What has informed a lot of how I approach this work is a learning opportunity that I took advantage of back in 2018, which is I think it was 2018. I attended the Racial Equity Institute in Greensboro, North Carolina, actually in the Research Triangle. And they have some operating principles that kind of form how this work is done. from their perspective. And what they do is they reflect on the work of Brian Stevenson, who wrote Just Mercy. I don't know if you know his work. He did lots of work with largely with African American men, largely that were on death row. His approach to this work, and I agree with this, is that when you're dealing with a large intractable problem like racism, that the solution to the problem really requires a proximity to the problem, that you're really diving into that problem, and it requires interventions that are meant specifically to deal with that problem, to focus on that particular problem. So I think that the idea of concentrating on racism is one of the only ways of effectively dealing with it. The other thing I will say is that, and I realize I maybe tried to say, but this concept of a rising tide lifts all boats, right? If you are not comfortable with, if you're working actively to dismantle racist structures, you are not going to be satisfied with homophobism. What am I trying to say? With homophobia. You're not going to be satisfied with sexism. I mean, those are not, attitudes and phenomena that you're going to be happy with. So I think that there is a lot of integration here, a lot of intersection and confluence between these issues. But again, I really think that we have to focus on the issue at hand. And in this particular case, it's around racism. I hope that, I don't know if that's, not a satisfying sort of answer to that, but that's how I see this work. Yeah, if you haven't read Just Mercy, I highly recommend it. It's very powerful. The movie is great too.
Well, thank you to all of those who asked questions. We will be sharing our information. So if you have those questions that you did not feel comfortable sharing in this space, you can always reach out. Once again, thank you for joining us and allowing us to share a bit more with you about the framework, where it is now, what we hope will come of that framework, and how you will utilize that framework. And thank you for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you both, Mark and Christina, for your time and sharing your expertise, and for everyone joining us today. I saw there was a question about when the recording will be available. It will be available very soon. Just takes a little bit of time to download it from Zoom. I would say by tomorrow. So please keep an eye out for that. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And again, Mark and Christina, we really appreciate you spending your afternoon with us. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks to all of you. Thanks for having us. Bye-bye.